Hello, everybody. I'm Big John. And this week on Liberty Lens, hey, listen, Washington just released a brand new national security strategy document. Actually, that sounds kind of important, right? But here's the problem strategy doesn't limit power, laws do. So today, Mike Termott and I are going to be asking the real question here. Does this plan actually restrain the security state, or does it just rebrand it while Congress quietly funds the same military industrial complex it always has? Welcome again, everybody. This is Big John, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm here with my co host, Mr. Mike Termott. Mike, how are you tonight?
I'm good. It's great to be with you, John.
Yes, indeedy, indeedy. And, this one is going to be an interesting one because as we were talking before we turned the camera on, this might be a little nerdy ish, but we're not going to use numbers. It's not economic nerds.
Thank goodness.
It's policy nerds, right? And what's interesting here is that this sort of thing goes on every year, right, Mike? You haven't, the document we're talking about is the National Security Strategy Document, or NSS for short. And basically, Mike, why don't you tell us what is the purpose of the NSS? And I'm gonna fumble that acronym.
The purpose is the purpose is whatever the White House wants the purpose to be.
Right.
In the past, the purpose was to lay out a very detailed vision of what America's foreign policy would be, particularly in the area of defense.
Right.
So as to send a signal to a couple of important constituencies. One is Congress, who has to fund all of this. One is our allies, particularly at least in the past up until now, particularly in Europe. And a third constituency would include our adversaries, so that they would know what it is that we were taking seriously, perhaps what we're upset about, perhaps what it is that we would prioritize, and therefore send a signal, don't mess with us when it comes to X or Y or Z, and therefore try to, as they say, Bigfoot somebody out of an area where we wanted to dominate without having to go to war over it. So it serves important reasons. And given that, it has typically been a longer document than this one. Right. It is typically written as though 115 nerds at the State Department and the Defense Department and the Information Complex Department had weighed in on it, which was the case, actually a heck of a lot more than 115. And that's how it read. Very careful, very staid, very much in need of interpretation. If you were not familiar with the concepts, it would be, in some cases, tough to read, and certainly virtually impossible to figure out what it is the White House wanted you to know.
Right. Okay, so let me see if I could translate that into a little bit of English here, because I'm not as smart as you are, Mike, and I don't read much. and I don't read much.
The first of many lies.
And that's the important thing here is I don't read much. You read a lot, so that's what I like in my co-host. But let's see tell me if I've got this a little bit straight. So the NSS kind of lays out the administration's, the president's world vision. And the NSS really is an executive document, right? Like that piece of it does not go before Congress. It doesn't lay out what the country per se wants to do. It literally is a vision of the way President Trump and his cabinet or his closest advisors view the U.S. role in the world, right?
That's right.
As part of that, I mean, we have to mention it. People are saying that this very much lays out a Monroe Doctrine sort of view of the world. They're calling it the Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is like basically hands off our part of the world. And make no mistake, this is our part of the world with a capital O in O-U-R, right?
That's right.
And of course, this dovetails into what we see the president always talking about, what his entire staff talks about, which is America first, or at least what he thinks is America first. So we're heading towards, would you say, making sure as policy that Western hegemony, U.S. hegemony, is in place from a how we deal, like you said, with both friends and enemies, from that perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
There always is.
Let's take the Trump corollary first, and what you're referring to, of course, is what the document calls the Trump corollary. By the way, just to wrap up what we were talking about earlier, this document, in contrast to past documents, is shorter. It is written with different constituencies in mind, or at least a different attitude and style in mind. It's written very polemical. It talks about the president's vision. It stands up for the president's accomplishments. It's a lot closer to what you might expect from the president's posts on Truth Social than what you would expect from a national security strategy in the past.
Yeah, so like you said, it reads more like a campaign a pamphlet than it does a policy document, right?
Very campaign-ish. And that's not to say that it isn't serious. It's not to say that it isn't reflective. And it does point out a lot of changes that have happened in the world and the reason the president sees the world different. All of that is terrific, but it is definitely written in a different style, much more accessible to millions more Americans, not just to policy nerds in Moscow and Beijing or in Washington. This is absolutely accessible to the rest of us, whether we're in Charlottesville or Des Moines or anywhere else. So in that sense, it's a very interesting document. And
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And to your next question about the Trump corollary, the document talks about different regions of the world, one at a time. It also talks about the relative importance of those regions and makes no bones of the fact that the administration believes that we need to be prioritizing the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, at a much higher level than we have been up until now. And while it doesn't quite say so, it definitely leaves you with the impression that we would be prioritizing the Western Hemisphere ahead of other regions around the world, particularly in a relative sense, relative to years past. And in the section on the Western Hemisphere, in the section on the Americas, it uses this term Trump corollary. And what it means is a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was what President Monroe put forward 200 years ago, which is to say that the United States will not tolerate colonialism in our hemisphere. In other words, what has gone on in the past is the past, but going forward, European powers are not welcome to initiate further colonialism in this hemisphere. And the updated versions have always been interpreted to mean, and we're not going to tolerate dominance from other powers, whether European or Chinese or Russian, in this hemisphere beyond a certain level. And it's never been really clear beyond what level. Because, for example, we have tolerated the Cuban government's tight relationship, the Venezuelan government's tight relationship with the Russians, with the Chinese, the Cubans, certainly with Moscow. There are other examples. Whereas a lot of folks have suggested over the years, starting with John Kennedy's administration, that we should be toppling the Cuban government and not putting up with that. Well, the Trump corollary is an updated, once again, updated version of the Monroe Doctrine that is much more proactive. It's not waiting to see what happens if another power tries to come into our hemisphere. It's saying we're going to be proactive about pursuing America's interests, and we are going to use economic levers to push for what it is that we want. It's going to be a little bit more aggressive we're going to exert our dominance. And there is an implication, if you read the other sections, the non-Western Hemisphere sections, there is an implication. You have to read between the lines, but there's a little bit of implication that goes so far as to suggest that we might be willing to tolerate a little bit greater role for China in its neck of the woods, as long as it doesn't cross certain lines.
Right, right. And of course there is something called the Atlas line in there, right? They're referring to, that's sort of like their line in the sand. So Mike,
Yep.
before we go any further, let's talk about what you just said, which is, like, to me, this always sounds very strange, right? Because if America is supposed to be this bastion of free trade and self-determinism and all that fun stuff that we, especially as libertarians, love to crow about, how justified is the United States in saying uh, that a non-military threat, that we should eliminate all non-military threats preemptively? For example, Venezuela has a very a cozy economic relationship with China. That's a very obvious one. You have the whole BRICS thing going on in South America, Latin America, right? The Cuban one is the most obvious one we've had to deal with, like you said, since Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs, and CIA coup attempts on Castro, Operation Mongoose, the whole nine
Yep.
yards, right?
Yeah. For the benefit of your younger viewers, Khrushchev, who ran the Soviet government in the early 60s, tried to build missile silos and
Yes.
put nuclear tipped missiles in Cuba that could obviously reach any place in the United States. And the Kennedy administration said, stop construction, get rid of them, and then initiated a blockade of Cuba to stop it. And it was a bad confrontation. So
It was a very bad confrontation. You're absolutely right. But see, that I'm almost willing to excuse from this sort of discussion, because that was very clearly a military threat. But
right.
now we're also talking about economic threats. We're talking about just, hey, we just don't like certain people in our neck of the woods type of thing. Like the old cop, what are you doing in this neighborhood, right? Sorry, no offense to you, Mike, in your past job there. but you know what I mean, right? Like it's throwing your weight around, it's being a bully. The fact that they make no bones, even in this document, about the continued use of tariffs as punitive economic measures. And again, we've discussed the economic effect on US citizens, but now we're saying, like, we're going to use this as a blunt instrument, tariffs. We're going to throw our weight around. And to the extent that you might be throwing other parts of the world under the bus, like you said, we don't care what China does in their neck of the woods, as long as it's almost like a Godfather line. I don't care what a man does to earn a living, as long as it doesn't conflict with mine, right? So it's that sort of thing, Mike. And how does this play with the rest of the world? Because part of this is going to be, like you said, how this document is perceived by allies, by neutral participants, by trade partners. That, hey, is the US going back to being like the biggest kid on the block, the biggest bully on the block? Is that what we're heading even more back to?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. The document does paint a picture of a more restrained foreign policy, a more restrained projection of military power around the world. There's no question about that. So from a libertarian perspective, that's all good. But it does give one the sense that perhaps the biggest change is merely that we would be targeting our militaristic interventionism in our own hemisphere. That remains to be demonstrated. I think it's incumbent upon us, to be fair to the administration, to point out that in the case of Venezuela, we're talking about a head of state, ostensible nominal head of state, who we do not view as legitimate, not because we don't like him, but because he stole away the election, and who has been indicted by a federal court in the United States relative to drug running. So, this is a bad guy. This isn't merely a case of, gee, you've got a relationship with the Chinese and we're worried about it, so, you've got to go, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that. How this plays out remains to be seen. But clearly the administration is signaling that we want to show restraint around the world, not isolationism, right? Not isolationism, but restraint in terms of projecting military power, and a much more, as you point out, muscular posture from an economic point of view. The administration continues to believe in tariffs, and not just as a lever for negotiation. Clearly, the administration continues to believe that tariffs are a good idea in order to raise revenue and to force companies to invest in capital in the United States and to protect certain industries. There are strategic reasons to protect industries where it's a strategic supply chain issue and you don't want to be dependent on something produced abroad from which you might get cut off in international conflict. That makes sense. But as you know, the administration's use of tariffs has gone far beyond that. And the administration really doesn't have much of a leg to stand on in this regard. It's a horrible way to raise revenue. It's not a good reason to impose tariffs to try to get people to invest in the United States. It just means less efficient investment than would have taken place otherwise. But interestingly, to your point, fascinatingly, the document talks about reindustrialization of the United States and promoting that through the use of tariffs. Well, could there be a more 20th century term than reindustrialization, right? The United States is virtually at full employment now. It's not like we're all worried about all of this unemployment, all these workers sitting around with nothing to do. The issue is, how do you drive up wages? And the answer is to run an economy as efficiently as possible. And that means allowing free markets to work and not messing things up with tariffs.
Yeah, and to your point, it really is something that I think we all, being good free marketeers, good whoever, pick your favorite economist, Friedman, Rothbard, whoever, Mises, whoever. Tariffs are not good for the economy. But can we also agree that this is more of a, I can do this, therefore I will? I don't have to justify. If you're Trump, you're saying I don't have to justify using tariffs. I think they work. I can do them. Now, there is a Supreme Court ruling pending. Of course, that could change this. I don't know how much you want to talk about that, but if the Supreme Court goes against the president, now there's so many subplots to this, Mike, because obviously they could rule against him on emergency use of tariffs. He could still try to put them through other avenues legislatively, right? But I would still be concerned of two things. One is the president. We joked about this, but I think it's part of his nature. He really thinks this is 17th century mercantilism at play, right? Like, you have this, like, hey, no playing in our backyard. Tariffs number one, and reindustrialization. Like, I don't know when we decided that we have to reindustrialize the United States. It's still
No, it's a
progressing
bad
forward.
idea.
It's a horrible idea.
It's a horrible idea.
So when you look at all this, does it really just strengthen the impression that the president might be living in somewhere around 1820?
When
Or
it comes to
1760?
economic policy and his understanding of how national economies work, he's absolutely stuck in the 19th century.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. The issue is, why is he getting such crappy staff work? Again, is what we talk about every week. He gets such horrible staff work that people don't scooch policy in a more modern direction and just focus tariffs on those select few areas where it's strategically necessary to protect certain, strategic industries that you need access to in a time of conflict, or those areas where you absolutely have to punish someone and use them as negotiating leverage. Whereas the president has clearly gone too far when, there's Chinese pushback and all of a sudden farmers in Iowa are going under and you need a farm bailout now. It's just, one layer of silliness on top of another. It's been a complete unmitigated disaster.
Right.
So I think you're right. The president is stuck in the 19th century when it comes to understanding economics, and that's a real shame. The other thing that's interesting, not only does he make this point, but he makes it in the national security strategy document.
That's what I meant initially when I said it reads more like a campaign pamphlet, right? Because
Yeah.
it's almost like he had to hit all his talking points that is popular with his base. But I'm wondering, like, his base, most people typically have no clue what an NSS is. I'll be honest with you, until you brought it up as a subject for this episode, I was like, what is an NSS? I have to look it up. I
They're
have to
not
educate.
terribly, they're typically not very interesting because
Yeah,
the United States government is not usually going through much change, right? You know, we went through a lot of change, obviously, to enter the world wars, to come out of the world wars, how we were going to position, you know, what do you do about Vietnam?
right.
But since then, it's been pretty much the same, which is not good, but it's been pretty much, we need to dominate the world.
Right.
We need to project power. If we don't, the world's going to hell in a handcart. And that's why we need a big budget. That's why we need to forward deploy troops. That's why we need to tamp down anybody who tries to exert a lot of influence over this region or that region. We need to run the show, and not just as the nation's, the world's policeman, but in terms of the rule maker. You know, we have always considered ourselves the only appropriate place to make the rules, and then we enforce them, you know, both.
Yeah.
And that's a big lift. And were it not for the Trump administration, I have to give the Trump administration a lot of credit here. Were it not for this president, we would still be going down a neocon policy of dominating the world, the expense that comes with it, and the forfeiture of a great deal of what we call American exceptionalism, which traditionally we have viewed as coming from the fact that we were a classically liberal democracy and that our job is to spread democracy around the world and thereby spread capitalism and thereby lift the entire world out of poverty. That's worth doing, right? And you forfeit a lot of that with a neocon policy that says everyone's got to do what we tell them to do or we're going to blow them up.
Right. But now let's talk about a subtle shift, right? Because I still sense that President Trump is all behind let's tell the world what to do, right?
Yeah.
He's all behind that. That part of the equation hasn't changed. I think it's just the face that he's put on it and how he plans on executing, right? We talked about the using the tariffs, for example,
Yep.
as leverage and as punitive actions, right? But also in this NSS, as if to say, hey guys, don't think I forgot about this. He cites, or I should say the document cites, that border control and immigration control is the largest threat to national security. It's almost as if saying, hey, just in case some of you people think these court rulings or anything going against me are going to slow me down. No. I am officially stating that I think the number one threat to the US is essentially immigration.
Fascinating.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah, to your earlier point that it reads a little bit like a campaign document, and maybe this is the reason why it was focused on economic issues. The other big issue area, immigration, is included here that is typically not included in a national security strategy
Right.
document.
Right.
Right. Well, look, the Biden administration didn't even bother controlling the border, much less talk
Right.
about it, much less talk about it as a strategic issue. So
Right.
you know that this is different. I think the Trump administration should be commended for getting control over the border for a variety of reasons. Whether it belongs in a national security strategy document is another kettle of fish.
Right.
But you cannot argue that they're being disingenuous about it, in the sense that they're doubling down on this concept of borders matter,
Right.
in the sense that the document is taking the Europeans to task over immigration in their own context. The administration is suggesting that the Europeans are subjecting themselves to, here's a phrase that we haven't heard before, right? Cultural erasure, meaning you're taking societal erasure, meaning you're taking yourself out of the world. And the implication is that you're doing that through immigration. It's not exactly spelled out, but that's the implication, that Europe is no longer European. That is said. Europe is no longer going to necessarily be European. It goes so far as to say we may not recognize Europe in 20 years. Meaning Europe is defined through its ethnicities, right? That's fascinating, not only as an assertion, but as an assertion that you would find in a strategy document.
See, that's the part that look, the assertion that whether Europe will still be European, look, frankly, that's the Europeans' headache. I couldn't care less one way or another, right? Because that is for each sovereign state in Europe, or Europe as a collective, or the EU, whatever. Which is what I find fascinating when people tell me Trump is trying to reel it in some ways, right? Because granted, he's not deploying the armies there. But if he's taking this approach, and I'm going to be a little bold here, Mike, this is where you get to admonish me. But this sort of mirrors that whole replacement theory that you hear in certain far right circles, right?
Yeah.
And for the president to even use language adjacent to that, let me give him credit and say he hasn't used that language, but he's using adjacent language. Why, to your point, is this some of the U.S. interest? Right? It should, like, even if I disagree with his immigration policy, at least the immigration policy is U.S. immigration policy. The fact that he's trying to lecture Europeans on it, and then the question becomes, what if they say no? What if London says, look, we love being multicultural, and we don't care about all these other far right wing guys. We're going to continue to be a nation of immigrants as far as London goes, say, and the rest of England. What does that imply for the Trump administration? Do they have to take action, Mike, based on this positioning?
I don't think they do, but there are a lot of Europeans that are worried. There are a lot of Europeans. I believe it's needless worry, but one man's worry is another man's caution.
Hey, perception is reality, right?
And perception can be a very important reality. A lot of Europeans are very concerned the United States is turning into an adversary as opposed to an ally.
Yeah.
No question about that. And this document feeds that. When you're lecturing someone about how you live your life, right? This goes back to J.D. Vance's speech in Germany several months ago. If you can't stand up for free speech, the United States can't help you, is basically what he was saying. The problem for those who would want to give J.D. Vance the benefit of the doubt is that he says this in the context of the Europeans' censure of right-wing politicians. And so it definitely comes off as self-serving. And I do believe that there's an element of calculation in the Trump administration's inclusion of this in the NSS. I think the Trump administration sees a fairly positive feedback loop here. If we stand up for right-wing organizations abroad, not only will they stand up for us, but our constituents domestically will appreciate that. I don't know whether that logic holds water in the long run, but I get it, right?
Right.
And it's an old political, I don't want to call it stunt. It's an old political maneuver to stand up for like-minded politicians abroad. People have, Democrats have stood up for Labor in London, and
right.
And conservatives have stood up for the Tories and vice versa. And you do see trends that cross international lines in terms of political movements carrying elections. So, we get all that. That makes some sense. But how the administration positions this as being in our interest is fascinating. To your point, why would it be in our interest? This is what worries the Europeans, is that it does seem that America's interest includes admonishing the Europeans. And I think that a fair read of the document would indicate that that attitude is excused by the societal erasure. In other words, I don't think it's merely the administration saying, you guys stink, and by the way, you're taking yourself out of the picture. There is a lot of that. But I think that the document is saying, you guys stink, and we're going to turn our energy and focus elsewhere because you're becoming less important. Importantly, the document points out that Europe is getting smaller relative to the rest of the world. I wish that the document had pointed out that this is in no small part because of population changes. The United States is a growing population. Europe has a shrinking population. That matters, right? One of the reasons I don't fear the Chinese economy is because their demography is all messed up. But in Europe, it's even worse. Not only are they shrinking relative to the rest of the world, but being such a socialist country, they're going to have a very hard time supporting their pyramid scheme of having enough youngsters taking care of oldsters as they retire. The Europeans are headed for an economic disaster. And at the same time, they're being asked to step up from 2% to 5% of GDP spent on defense. The document points this out. This is, of course, the right thing to do, to pressure these people into taking care of their own defense. We have been enabling bad behavior for 3 generations now, allowing them not to take care of themselves. And it's high time this gets fixed. A lot of credit has to go to the president in particular and the administration in general for pushing for this change, which is, no question about it, in America's interest.
Yeah, listen, I can agree that when the Trump administration does something positive, it always seems though my contention is they do something positive and immediately on the tail of that is something that I would totally disagree with, right? So yeah, okay, you want to increase and take, fund your own defense, 100% behind that. Then you couple it with, and you're losing your Europeanness. And if you don't stop that, we may not trade with you. Or
yeah, it comes off as dopey.
Well, it comes up as dopey. It comes off as, I'm your big brother. You're supposed to listen to me. It comes off very paternalistic, which internally in the U.S., we would say we don't want our government being paternalistic, especially as libertarians. We don't want the government having a nanny state. So that sort of is very, very interesting that on the one hand, they'll be like, oh, okay, we're not going to be the world's policeman, except in Venezuela, except in areas close to home. We'll still be cops down there.
Or it's okay for us to be the culture policeman.
Right. The non-military police, right?
Like, we're not going to, we're all done with Article 5 of NATO, which hasn't been said yet, by the way. I need to be careful. But we're all done with this NATO concept. But that doesn't mean we're not going to lecture you on how to run your society and immigration policy, right? Which is kind of weird. I also think it's a little bit weird that we would be lecturing, let me pick an example, the French on how important it is to stay French. Of all the people that don't need that lecture, right? It's the Europeans. I don't know what proportion of our audience has been to rural France, but there is no question that the French population believes that there is, let me put as positive a spin on this as I possibly can. There is nothing better you can be than French, right?
Oh, sure. There's 2 people in the world, French and not French, right? So yeah. But okay, let me ask you a tough question.
And it's funny coming from us because we're the ones who
We're the ugly Americans.
Well,
Right? I mean, let's face it.
I am, but look, we're the ones that stand up for cultural adaptation and tolerance, and we bring people in from all over the world.
We used to.
And our culture is based on not a unique ethnicity. It's not based on culture tied to your ethnicity. It's not really even tied to the culture of where it is that you came from. It's based on tolerance for, whatever culture you bring
Right.
here. We're not a melting pot, we're a mosaic. And this is inherent in what makes America great. It's what makes us entrepreneurial. It's what allows us to focus on economic issues and not cultural issues. It
Right.
is truly a defining element of the American experience that makes us unique and makes us terrific. And so for us to say otherwise is weird. But for us to say otherwise to the Europeans is comical.
Right.
Like what are you doing? Right? It's like telling the Chinese or the Japanese, who are notorious for being skeptical about immigration,
Sure.
gee, you really ought to have less immigration. It's insane.
Well, let me ask you a tough question, because honestly, there's an undercurrent of this. It popped in my head when I hear things like this in terms of policy. Let me just throw it out there. Is this really that the administration is concerned about Europe not being as white as it was previously? And I'm purposely using that language because I think if you were to talk to an opponent of the president, if you were to talk perhaps to some people on the left here,
Yep.
they might argue that this is a dog whistle or coded language for you guys are importing, you're allowing too much immigration, not just in principle, but from the wrong places. The same way it is here. Let's face it, right? I don't hear the president complaining about immigration from Netherlands or Sweden or Denmark. He complains about
I understand.
immigration from certain areas, right?
Yeah.
So talk to me about that.
Yeah. My guess is the answer is no.
Okay.
And the reason I think the answer is, and let me be careful, probably no,
Okay.
is that it's a mix and an amalgam of what it is
Mhm.
to be European. So the administration is saying, you guys need to be careful. You're not going to be recognizable. You're not going to be as European. Well, what does that mean? It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But what's relevant is whether or not the Europeans continue to stand up for a set of values that continue to dovetail with our own.
Mm.
And one could easily argue, I think most of us could be sensitive to the argument that if you turn your society upside down, I'm not saying that they are, but if you were to do so, it gets pretty random, whether in 10 years or 30 years or 75 years, this is a society, these are a set of societies that continue to stand up for liberal democracy. So, those concerns can come from a number of places other than just racism. And I think that that's what Vance was talking about when he was in Germany, is that if you don't stand up for the same set of values, what do we got? Because we didn't sign on to Article 5 because we love French cuisine. We signed up for Article 5 because we have a shared heritage in terms of standing up for liberal democracy. That's the truth. That's the truth. And then I would layer on top of that, I haven't heard language from around the administration that makes me worry about explicit racism. It makes me worry about immigration policy. Absolutely. It makes me worry about their definition of democracy versus mine. They're two different things. There's no question about it. So I have a lot of worries, but I wouldn't hang it on racism. In that sense, I almost worry more,
Mm.
right? If you were to say, oh, we have a racist administration, here's the reasons why this is the case. Here's the language that's been used or the policies, and therefore this is the problem we have. I think that's easier to defeat over the long run than we are in the process of redefining what we mean by classical liberal democracy and its role in the world going forward, because that's what's at stake, right? The world is not about to be taken over by racists, but the world is locked in an important battle of democracy versus authoritarianism. And that's the battle I don't want to lose. That's what I want to worry about. And so I worry that the administration is allowing certain things to take place in parts of the world. I'm not advocating for military interventionism, but I do worry that the administration is standing up for conditions that would give rise to authoritarianism that we shouldn't be putting up with.
Fair enough, Mike. And I'm going to end the NSS portion of our show on that note. However, there is a second piece here that really doesn't get talked about a lot. And we're talking about the kissing cousin to the NSS, which is the NDAA. It's acronym night tonight. The NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, basically, whereas the NSS is an executive function, the NDAA is a legislative function. It's up to Congress. And what does it do? It basically funds everything that might be included in the NSS. So if the president has a vision, where you would get the money for all that stuff is from the NDAA. Now it would be interesting to compare and see where the two documents converge and where they diverge. Does the NDAA support the president's vision, or is it significantly different from the president's vision?
It's different. Go ahead. I'm sorry, John.
No, I was going to say, because outwardly, while the president talks about reigning in power, and whereas some of us might be concerned, is he pointing it inwards, right, with ICE running around and all this sort of thing? The NDAA keeps rolling along. It keeps funneling money to the military-industrial complex. It keeps funneling money as if we're engaged in 3 wars. It keeps funneling money like we might go to war at any second, right? Now, is that prudent spending? Is that preparedness? Is that the folks who slap together this NDAA, this appropriation, they view the world differently than the president? Talk to me about that.
Well, they certainly don't mind spending money. That's the first thing you got to notice, is that the amount of money that Congress is authorizing to be spent on defense continues to go up one year after another. It seems like 1,000 years ago that politicians talked about the peace dividend, right? Yeah. We were no longer going to be locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and we were going to be able to start saving money. That didn't happen.
Nope.
that didn't happen. So I think the best way to illustrate this is to look at the need for the Department of Defense to focus on cyber issues, for example, artificial intelligence, new technologies that are being brought to bear on the battlefield, not only cyber attacks on defense assets, but cyber attacks on the homeland, on our businesses, on our homes, on our infrastructure, particularly energy. These are relatively new threats, not completely new, but certainly accelerating in some sense. We're particularly worried about AI. We're particularly worried about drones, right? Very difficult things to counter, difficult and expensive things to develop. Okay, super. We get that. I wish that much more time had been spent in the national security strategy document on these emerging threats and technologies, but okay, they weren't. I get it. The NDAA put money into these areas. One might call that the good news. The bad news is it wasn't instead of funding everything else. It was just on top of continuing to fund everything else. So there is a big conversation, as you know, and a lot of our viewers know, there's a big conversation going on about how worthless aircraft carriers are. No one's talking about, running with fewer than 11. If they're so worthless, how come we're going to continue going with 11 instead of, I don't know, pick a number, 10?
0. Yeah.
you know,
No, and it does, to your point, there's still funding for Space Force. There's still funding for sending troops halfway across the world just to posture, right?
Yep.
You're still focused on China-focused activities, whether it's
Yep.
naval, missiles, cyber spending, and to your point, some of it is, yeah, you got to spend if you're going to, even if you take a purely defensive posture, you have to spend. There's always new technologies. There's always new threats. I get that part. But despite the NSS saying, hey, we're going to reel it in, we're not going to be the world's police force, we're not going to be part of NATO, between the lines and things of that nature, Congress is spending money as if the exact opposite was in the NSS.
Yeah, there's no peace dividend. There's just a changing technology premium.
Right. It's
So now we
actually
have
more money.
multiple technologies that we have to
No.
fund, multiple ways of fighting wars, right? Now you have to be able to deploy drones. You have to defend against drones, which is a very expensive proposition.
Right.
You need supersonic missiles. You need to defend against supersonic missiles. Again, a very expensive proposition. The Congress and apparently the Department of Defense both believe that we need to continue to fund aircraft carriers around the world, and yet we need the technologies to replace them simultaneously. This is a very expensive proposition. And technologies change all the time, but this is one of the reasons why every time technologies change, things just get more and more expensive, not less expensive. And interestingly, folks are talking about the fact that you need to be able to fight not only in multiple theaters, you need to be able to fight in multiple ways. That's one of the reasons why this gets so expensive. What if you were fighting an adversary and you had to fight cyber, you had to fight with drones, you had to fight ground troops, you had to fight in the air? Every single one of these has to be funded. It gets more expensive rather than less. But we know that we have to start shifting away from the very expensive way of fighting a war with humans and get it toward drones, get that cost down, because we need to be able to view drones as being expendable, whereas you would not consider that to be the case. Not in this country. You wouldn't consider that to be the case for personnel, right? And this is why it just gets more and more expensive.
It does. And part of it, though, also is the pork associated with it, right? Like, no senator is going to vote against funding, for example, the boot camp, or no one's going to close Fort Dix. No one is going to close Fort Benning, right? Like,
or a naval base in
or
Norfolk, Virginia Beach. That's not going to happen.
Right. So you're locked into it. It can only go up. But to the extent that it is so divergent from the president's strategic vision, if we call it that, why aren't we seeing a little bit more meeting of the minds? Why isn't it that the president will go to Congress and say, like, I know I'm talking about Trump as a cost cutter, which has never been the case, right? But let's say, why isn't the president going to congressional leaders who, by the way, let's emphasize, Republicans who control Congress, right? So in theory, this should not be that difficult a deal, is go in there and say, hey, let's cut back funding on those aircraft carriers. Let's commit to decommissioning one aircraft carrier. Let that be our first step in a road that travels 1,000,000 miles, Mike. Why isn't the president doing that? I mean, he seems to be more than happy to go to Congress to get money for ICE, to have, basically a military force turned on our own citizens, but he's unwilling to go in there and stand up for.
There's just no political pressure to do so.
Okay.
That's the answer. there's no contentiousness between Congress and the White House because they're in the same party, and because not enough Americans are pressuring Congress to save money in the defense budget. By the way, the defense budget doesn't preclude the White House from reorienting its focus from Asia to the Americas, for example, or from Europe to the Pacific or anything like that. The administration can do what it wants in that regard, even if there's certainly implications in the budget. It doesn't tie the president's hands, which is interesting in and of itself.
Right.
But there is no political pressure on Congress to do something about this. And I believe that this goes back to the fairly fundamental problem that most Americans don't realize how damaging to our economy, the extent to which it reduces our wage rate and our income overall, to have such huge public expenditures on everything, but in particular in defense. There's just not a hue and cry for that peace dividend.
Right. It's sad, but we'll always prioritize war over peace. It's a sad
safety
statement.
and control.
Yeah.
And the neocons would characterize Trump's policy of restraint, maybe I should say aspiration to restraint. Right. We see in Venezuela this week, it doesn't look much like restraint.
Yeah.
But let me go with aspiration to restraint. Neocons like to Republican and Democrat both. Neocons like to characterize that as isolationism, which is a complete misnomer, mischaracterization. I would go so far as to argue that a restrained policy when it comes to military interventionism is less isolation than the neocon policy of going around blowing everything up.
Probably because you would have a more
economically integrated
world. I was going to say it's a more connected world. It's
a more connected world if you're not always looking over your shoulder wondering whether supply chains are going to fail in times of a conflict.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Hopefully this conversation on the NSS and the NDAA wasn't too nerdish for you. Hopefully you enjoyed what we had to say. Please join us again next week on Liberty Lens, where we'll talk about another interesting subject of interest to both lovers of liberty and just people who like to be informed. He's Mike Termott. I'm Big John. So hit the subscribe button right here on Mike's channel. Follow us, won't you? I'm Big John _SXM. You can see it right there on Twitter. He's Mike Termott. You can see his name down there on Twitter. Follow us both for some more comments and ideas, and certainly leave a comment, smash the subscribe button. All right, everyone, until next week, we'll see you again. Peace.